what you do here at
Sure.
Loyola.
So I'm a professor here in the School of Education, and I teach in the counseling and counseling psychology programs. I have been here since 1993. I teach classes in prevention, outreach, and advocacy, adolescent development, human development, supervision. That probably is what I've been teaching mostly lately. I also teach classes in family therapy, couples therapy. So.
Perfect. How would you personally define advocacy?
Okay. Well, this is a great topic for me. This is something that I'm pretty passionate about. Obviously, teach it in one of my classes, but even before we had the class, I feel like it's a really needed skill for counselors to have. So for me, advocacy is about giving voice to a cause or giving voice to perhaps a population or an issue that affects people who have been historically marginalized or feel disempowered. So part of it is about, using power and privilege to forward issues that really affect people who are not fortunate enough to sometimes be at the table.
Perfect. So I hear you saying that that you talk about the marginalized population and that you really try and focus on people in the community who really don't have a voice.
Mm-hmm.
What types of clients do you think you work most with in the community with your work?
Sure. I think it varies, but in general, it's urban populations of color. In particular, lately, I've been doing a lot of advocacy work for kids who are immigrants and their families, and in particular, who are in schools learning English. Maybe coming from families where English is either not a language or certainly not a first language, and trying to help schools really understand the needs of those kids and their families. So doing a lot of advocacy with superintendents and principals, as well as teachers and just school personnel. And then also trying to work to empower the immigrant parents to really understand the roles that they could take on within the school structure. So that's one example.
Okay, perfect. How do you think, I know earlier you mentioned that it's an important piece to have as a counselor, learning how to advocate for clients. What impact do you think it has on the profession or us as counselors?
Well, I think advocacy is how we change systems that don't work for people. That could be the people that we work with or just our ability to do work within a system for individuals. So I think it can be twofold. I think that it is important to be able to use our skills, our communication skills, and the knowledge that we have from whatever areas of expertise we have to educate other people, to raise awareness, especially in people who are in some position of power with respect to policy making. So that could be educating principals and superintendents who have a very strong ability to impact school policy. It could be talking with local politicians, again, who have the ability to change laws or change policies and practices. It can also go, all the way up into state and federal level advocacy. But it's really, I think, it's one of the few ways that we have to be involved in changing structures and changing policy, which trickle down and impact, like I said, the work that we do and the clients that we serve.
Okay. What would you say is the most difficult time you have to advocate for a client or a community?
I think that it depends. Difficult sometimes has to do with what has been the status quo, and I've certainly worked with a number of communities where, for example, there's been a lot of privilege and a lot of power allocated to a specific group of individuals. So if we talk about working in some of the North Shore suburb communities of Chicago, where there's a lot of money and folks have sort of lived their life a particular way and are not particularly open to districts being combined and new kids or less resourced kids coming into the school district and kind of really fighting that, seeing the kids as a problem. I think that when there are really, I guess, strong heels that have been dug into the ground and really people who are very resistant to change, it becomes sometimes very, I would say, adversarial, the advocacy. So it's sometimes hard to help them see that they have something to gain by changing the system. And so those have probably been some of the most challenging times when really people are not open to change. I think it's a lot easier when people maybe just are ignorant and don't really understand. And I've certainly had a number of good examples of where once people know certain things, they are open to changing the way that business is done or the way that they provide services. But I think when folks are very invested in no change and very invested in the status quo, it becomes a lot more just unpleasant.
So basically working with a community or school districts, like the higher up you go, the more difficult it could be to advocate?
Well, sometimes it's about like the higher up, but sometimes it's not. I mean, some of the most difficult conversations I've had have been with parents on a PTA about expanding inclusion so that they can get, maybe underrepresented parents to be a part of their group, which is not very high level. I mean, it's very low level, but again, I think when parents are really invested in the system works for me, it works for my kids, I don't want anything to change, it becomes difficult. I think, certainly I've done some federal level advocacy, and it becomes harder to measure outcomes at that level because you have certainly policies and bills that never get voted on, or sometimes you're waiting years and years and years to see the results of the efforts. But I don't know that it's necessarily harder. I think it depends on politically what the issue is and what the will and capacity for change of the legislative bodies happens to be at that moment.
Yeah, I was just going to say, it sounds like the more open people are to change, the easier the advocacy could be. When,
Yeah, and I think where there's, again, sort of a critical mass of people, of constituents, of opinions, of people who are really pushing for it, then it becomes, I think, sort of becomes the right thing to do, is to change with the times.
Would you have any practical advice for people in our class who are going to be in the field just as little as next year?
Sure. Yeah, I mean, I think that, when I teach advocacy in my class, really I think the first reaction that I get from a lot of students is that, wow, this feels really daunting, it feels really intimidating, because we ourselves, I don't think, have really been taught how to work those systems and how to think about systemic change at that level. But I think that there's a lot of organizations out there who really want to help us to use the power and the expertise that we have to advocate for others. So, for example, the American Psychological Association has an Office of Government Relations. It's, I think it's at apa.org/GRO. And basically, their job is to track bills that are going through at federal levels that have some relevance for the work that psychologists do. It could be very direct relevance, like looking at provider access for certain communities, but it can also be somewhat less direct. So if it's looking at something like the minimum wage bill, kind of looking at, well, what is the impact of raising the income levels of poor families. And so a lot of times organizations like APA will reach out to you if you're a member, or ACA, it's the same way. If you're a member, they will reach out to you through email and say, hey, here's a bill that's going through, we really need you to contact your legislator and get some input to this person about how you feel. And a lot of times they'll do all the work for you. They'll send you a template email.
Right.
They'll send you, here's the way to find out how to get this email to your particular senator or representative. And I think that taking advantage of those opportunities is a way to impact that higher structure, even if you're working at a very local level. I think too, the work that you all do, even as clinicians in the community, you will come to see, if you haven't already, that there's a lot of systems that are broken out there, whether that be child welfare systems, whether that be systems of support for families who are low income, and trying to do what you can to make sure that through voting and through the input that you do have, that we try to affect those systems to trickle down and make life better for the clients that we serve is something I think that should always be in your mind's eye, especially because I've done certainly a lot of work with families who are just, being sort of besieged with problems and stress, and you sort of at some level know that you can only help them to a certain point, and those systems have to become better for them in order for them to have a good quality of life. And so I think it is always important to think about, like, what can I do in this moment with this family, but then what are the bigger implications of what is standing in the way of this family doing better, and how can I be involved with changing some of those elements as well. And like I said, if you stay involved with your professional organizations, they all have, whether it's an office or a subcommittee of folks who are very aware of the importance of changing policy. And what they want is for professional constituents to contact the people who represent them and say, hey, we're paying attention to these issues, we want to hold your feet to the fire. And that's a way to have a voice and to use your voice to do something for the families and folks that you serve.
How do you think social justice and advocacy kind of go hand in hand or relate or don't relate?
Yeah, well, I think for me they're extremely closely related, because I think a lot of injustice starts at systemic levels. Either unfair policies or laws that aren't being enforced, or just practices that are negatively influence people, racism, sexism, homophobia. So I think to take a real stand against injustice, you really have to look at where it starts. And like I said, we can do some work to help people cope with injustice, and we can try to empower them to be organized and work collectively with other people to change their communities. But we also, I think, have a responsibility to try to interject, where we can in terms of advocacy. So I think for me, it's part of being committed to social justice is not being limited to traditional ways that we've been trained to work with people. Not that they're not effective, but they're very limiting.
Just as a closing, is there anything you would like to just tell the class, like as a professional who strongly believes in advocacy, as we go out into the professional world, like just any take-home messages?
Well, I think it's always easy to advocate for things that you feel passionate about. And so when I talk about advocacy in my class, I always say, like, sort of start with what matters to you and start with what matters within your world. So you don't have to be an advocate on every issue, nor really should you be, because you sort of lose your effectiveness, plus you're likely to burn out. But if you're somebody who's, very invested in a particular issue, like I spend a lot of time looking at, graduation rates and dropout rates of, kids of color in urban environments. I pay a lot of attention to any kinds of laws that can help that cause. And so, I think that if you try not to bite off too much, and kind of limit yourself to the causes that feel most relevant in your life, it's probably a good way to funnel energy. I know that we don't have a lot of extra energy, so we don't want to sort of overextend, but I think it is important to maybe pick the one or two things that you care about. And when you hear about, whether it's in the news or you get an email from an organization, saying, hey, I do want to support this. I am going to take 10 minutes to send an email, or I'm going to look something up and put it into an email and send it off. So I guess it's about sort of staying focused and, picking things that you're already passionate about, so it doesn't feel like you're having to convince yourself to do the work.
That's a good one. And lastly, just fun fact about Dr. Vera. How about you tell us something that you like to do outside of research, advocacy, teaching?
Sure.
What's something that you like to do?
Well, there's a lot of things I like to do. I think balance is really important, especially if you're going to do advocacy work, because more times than not, you don't get to see the successes of your advocacy work. There's a lot of going back to the drawing board and saying, well, that wasn't exactly what we needed, but we will stick with it. So I do think you have to be balanced. For me, balance comes in the form of sort of taking care of myself physically. So I have a second-degree black belt in Taekwondo, and I work out at least 3 times a week with that. I also really enjoy travel and nature, and so I scuba dive. Picture of me in the water there, and I try to do that as often as I can. It's also a really great way to see beautiful places in the world. So for me, nature is an important part of balance, and taking care of myself physically is an important part. I have 2 dogs I spend time taking care of, so that gets me outside and kind of gives me that sense of balance. So those are little fun facts. I don't know how fun they are.
Yeah,
but
no,
they're
those
facts.
are great. And I do notice that you always paint your nails.
I
on
do,
color,
yeah,
so.
I do. Let's try to keep my nails painted. That's another kind of meditative practice.
Yeah. All right, well, thanks so much.
Oh, you're